Virgin Most Powerful Radio, sharing the gospel with clarity and charity.
And now, Virgin Most Powerful Radio is pleased to present Hands-On Apologetics with renowned Catholic author and apologist, Gary Michuta.
And welcome everybody, Hands-On Apologetics. You have entered into Virgin Most Powerful's Apologetics Dojo, and it's great to be with you today to jump into where the rubber of catechesis meets the road of everyday life, and that is where we learn how to explain, share the faith with clarity, charity, confidence, and awesome show in store for us today because we're going to have the classical theist himself, John DeRosa, classicaltheism.com. Come on the other side of the break. He's got a remarkable new book. I wish this book was published like 2 or 3 years ago when the new atheism was, alive and well and stealing a lot of people, unaware people, through not through arguments, but really through cliches and rhetoric. It's still happening today. But when it first jumped on the scene, I think a lot of people weren't prepared for this kind of rhetorical type of cliche thinking. And so John has written this really good book, really remarkable book. It's called One More God Than You, where he systematically goes through the biggest cliches, the biggest, memes and things that will jump out at you that sometimes you're not really sure how to respond. And so he goes through it methodically. He shows you how to respond, how to think these things through, and how to challenge the friend who brings it up. So it's called One More God Than You. It's available through Catholic Answers Press. The reason why I'm plugging it is because, this is such a great resource. It's such a great resource for anyone who wants to defend and share the faith. If I were a youth group leader or DRE, or anybody involved in instruction of religion, I would pick this book up in a hot second and use it as a textbook. Because, man, if you get to the youth armed with this thing, it could really change things around. So anyway, John DeRosa is going to be coming up on the other side of the break. We're going to talk about more cliches. We already went over a few of them in previous programs, so we're going to tackle a few new ones. As always, we have our informal fallacy today. Today's Finding the Fallacy is the fallacy of the accident, and that's no accident. And also, the Meet the Early Church Father for today is Theophilus of Antioch. So lots of great stuff in store for us. But, first, as always, I want to start off by welcoming all of you to the program, those listening on radio around the country. I want to also give my shout-outs to those watching live stream on Facebook, YouTube, and all the other platforms. Hello, everybody. Hey, Marco and George. Hi, Colin. Hi, everybody. And also, I want to welcome all of you listening via podcast around the world, either through our handy-dandy phone app or our flagship website, which is virginmostpowerfulradio.org, or maybe YouTube. And welcome, everybody. I'm glad you're with us. Like I said, it's the program that's not only good, but it's good for you, because every time we are on the air, we're learning more informal fallacies, we're learning early church fathers, and we're getting great instruction from experts in the field. So, please be a regular listener, and if you haven't, please subscribe. This is another thing of our Apologetics in Place program. You can share the faith at the comfort of your own home. It just takes a click of your mouse or a tap on your iPhone. And please subscribe to Hands-On Apologetics on YouTube. And, do the thumbs up, the likes, tell people about the programs, because that helps grow the network. It helps grow the program. It also grows the outreach, so more people can also jump on the bandwagon, so to speak, the bandwagon, and learn, more critical thinking skills, learn about church history, and learn about defending a faith. So every day we have another reason to better know and love Jesus. So let's see. I think I covered everything. Maybe if you have a question for John DeRosa, give us a call, 888-526-2151. That is 888-526-2151. And also the Dojo mailbox for those who would rather send an email. If you have a question, comment, maybe you'd like to share something that's going on. Maybe you need a wall to bang some ideas off of. I will gladly volunteer to be a wall. If any of you have ever met me in real life, you know that my stature is pretty much that of a wall. So, but I do listen where walls will not. By the way, the Dojo mailbox is questions at handsonapologetics.com. Let me say that one more time. Questions at handsonapologetics.com. And, boy, so many things in store for us. Why don't we jump right in? Let's go with our finding the fallacy, which is the accident. And it's a informal fallacy. It's not a mistake. It's not a car crash. The fallacy of the accident is that when attempt is made to apply a general rule to all situations, even when clearly there are exceptions to that rule. So simplistic rules or laws rarely take into consideration legitimate exceptions, and to ignore these exceptions is to bypass reason in a sense. So basically, it's very simple fallacy to understand. You take a rule of thumb and you try to apply it to everything without exception. And of course, the thing about rule of thumbs is that, they're rules of thumbs. They're not so specific as to make a specific rule for each and every case. Let me give you an example. I found this on the internet. I think it's a good example. I believe one should never deliberately hurt another person, and that's why I will never be a surgeon. Okay, so that statement there commits the fallacy of the accident. Why? Because as a general rule, you should not do harm to another person. And yes, surgeons technically do harm people if you think about it. They remove body parts, they cause injuries, but that's in order to bring about greater health. So clearly there are exceptions to you should never hurt anybody. Sometimes you need to hurt somebody in order to make them well, as in the case with a surgeon. So that is the fallacy for today. The fallacy of the accident. And let's jump to Meet the Early Church Fathers. As you know, every program we go through the great collection of early Christian writings that stem back to the time of the apostles all the way until the 7th and 8th centuries. And these writings are so important because why? Because they reflect the beliefs of the earliest Christians. So if you want to learn what Jesus and the apostles handed on to the church, you need to hearken to the early church fathers because they will, in their writings, bring up ideas and teachings that are part of the Catholic faith way back when. So today's early church father is St. Theophilus of Antioch. St. Theophilus was the 7th bishop of Antioch and the 6th in succession from Peter. Little is known of him besides a few details which we can gather from his writing, which is To Autolycus. He was born near the Euphrates. He was a convert from paganism to Christianity as an adult, and after having made a careful study of the scriptures, he entered into the church. He died somewhere between the year 185 and 191 AD. Now, I believe we only have one surviving document from St. Theophilus of Antioch, and that is his treatise To Autolycus. Theophilus' writing is an apologetic work in 3 books. The 3rd book contains a chronology of the world, which ends with the death of Marcus Aurelius on March 17th in 180 AD. It's assumed then that this work was written around the same time, which is a good assumption. So let's take a few snippets from his work. Like I said, they reflect the beliefs of the early church, and so you'll see these things come out in the writings. For example, here's one little snippet. He says, "Are you unwilling to be anointed with the oil of God? It is on this account that we are called Christians, because we are anointed with the oil of God." And of course, Christian, comes from Christ, which means the anointed one. Let's see. He also points out quote, the 3 days before the luminaries were created are types of the Trinity. God, the Word, and His wisdom. And I believe this is, if not the first, one of the first instances where the word Trinity is used for application to God. So he goes to Genesis before the creation of the lights. You have God, you have the Word, and you have wisdom. He also continues, he says elsewhere, moreover, those things which were created from the waters were blessed by God, so that this might be a sign that men would at a future time receive repentance and remission of sins through water and the bath of regeneration. All who proceed to truth and are born again and receive a blessing from God. And of course, here he's hearkening to baptism, the sacrament of baptism, that it's not merely a sign that you have already come to faith in Christ and have already been saved and your sins are remitted. Rather, he says that the sign is, the water was created so that in the future it would be used for repentance, remission of sins through water or the bath of regeneration, which comes from Titus 3:1, I believe. Okay, let's see. We have a little bit of time. I might be able to squeeze in one more quote. He says this, quote, "Give studious attention to the prophetic writings, and they will lead you to a clear path to escape the eternal punishments and to obtain eternal good things of God. He who gave the mouth for speech and formed the ears for hearing and made eyes for seeing will examine everything and judge justly, granting recompense to each according to merit." And that is our early church father for today, St. Theophilus of Antioch. Coming up next, Master Apologist John DeRosa. And we're going to talk about answering atheistic cliches.
Jesus said in Luke 17, "When you have done all that you were ordered to do, say, 'We are unprofitable servants. We have only done our duty.'" According to St. John of the Cross, God is pleased with the little deeds we do in secret. He takes more pleasure in these than in a multitude of grand works that we may do out of the desire to be seen by others. May God help us to do the things that please Him, and not just to appear great in the eyes of others.
Did you know my mom's gonna have a baby?
She is? Will it be a boy? Or will it be a girl?
We don't know yet, but we heard the heartbeat and my dad said this is gonna be someone very special.
You mean like being a president? Or maybe a doctor?
Well, probably maybe like a singer or dancer, I think.
Hello, my name is Marianne Koharski. I'm the director of Pro-Life Across America. We know that every baby is a miracle and has the potential to do great things. If you know someone who is pregnant or in need of alternatives or assistance, or would like to support the work of Pro-Life Across America, please call 1-800-366-7773 or visit our website at prolifeacrossamerica.org. Pro-Life Across America is non-political and totally educational.
Pro-Life Across America, the Billboard people.
This is Terry Barber. I want to thank you for your support here at Virgin Most Powerful Radio. Here's an easy way to do it. If you're going to sell or buy a house, call Real Estate for Life, 877-543-3871, because they're going to get you a Christ-centered agent to purchase your home or to sell your home. And at the close of escrow, a portion of his commission goes right back to Virgin Most Powerful Radio. Call 877-543-3871. Thank you so much for your support.
Now, back to Hands-on Apologetics with Gary Machuda. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2151. Here's Gary.
And welcome back, everybody. Hands on Apologetics. And, many of us are pelted with these cliches and memes on the internet, usually by atheists or new atheists. How do you answer them? Well, our guest is going to help us work through that is John DeRosa, who received his undergraduate degree in math education from the College of New Jersey and an M.A. in pure and applied mathematics at Mount Clair State University. He is the the master of the website, masterful website, classicaltheism.com. He's also author of a new book. It's called One Less God Than You: How to Answer the Slogans, Cliches, Fallacies that Atheists Use to Challenge Our Faith. It's available through Catholic Answers Press, and highly recommend it. I was talking about that in the first segment. And John DeRosa, welcome back to the show.
Gary Machuda, thank you so much for having me on. I have to remind the audience that book would not exist in its final form without for your urging me to compile these slogans into a nice book form. So I appreciate your encouragement and happy to finally get it done.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And I'm pleased because when you showed me originally, it was it was smaller and it was going to be like a free ebook because you give out a lot of free ebook material on your website, classicaltheism.com. And I said, man, this stuff is just dynamite. You got to put this in book form so, a lot more people can have it. So, thank you for pursuing that.
No, I appreciate it. It started out, it was 9 slogans, 10 slogans. And every time I would see one of these here and there, whether it's on, Facebook, on Twitter, so forth, someone putting out a skeptical slogan to knock down believers, I would just kind of take note of it. And then eventually I got the list up to 12 and then 20 slogans. I'm like, all right, I got enough content here. We can go forward with the book. So, 20 slogans. I'm going to teach you how to respond in conversation, which is not always going to be, the surefire, perfect one sentence you can say to silence the other person. But I'm going to teach you questions you can ask, principles to keep in mind. And so that if you find yourself in a scenario where someone drops one of these, anti-religious slogans, you're not just thinking to yourself, oh my gosh, I have no idea what to say. You're going to have some questions, some principles, and you're going to be able to make some moves to kind of navigate the conversation. That's the goal for the book.
Yeah, and you do it in a great, very concise, easy to way read. So it's you certainly accomplished it. Now, the thing about these slogans and cliches is it really puts you on your heels if you're not prepared, because it comes at things from usually very unusual directions. What do you think are among the ones that most rattle believers?
No, it's a good question, and I chunk the slogans into like the popular ones, like there's no evidence for God or science has disproved God, to the more serious ones like, oh, well, if you believe in God, then how can children be dying in a hospital? Or why don't we have more evidence of him? A problem of divine hiddenness, to more serious ones. And then I have a bunch of slogans about faith and evidence. And we've talked about some of these on the show before, so I'll refer listeners back to previous episodes we did. But today I thought we could focus on what I think can most rattle Catholic Christians and believers are slogans about the Bible. I was listening to Trent Horn the other day, and he was like, if you talk to atheists, like, what's the number one book that you can give someone to make them an atheist? And it's not The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins, The End of Faith by Sam Harris. You know what atheists will say? They'll say, oh, it's the Bible. You give someone the Bible, tell them to read it, then they're going to emerge from that as an atheist. And the reason they say that is because they point to problematic passages, different moral issues. They say, oh, this is just obviously outdated, all these ridiculous miracles. So I think some of the slogans that can rattle believers the most are ones that like just kind of fling arrows at the Bible. And if we're not prepared, I'm preaching to myself here too. As Catholics, we got to study the Bible better. We got to do a better job of that. Try to make it part of our daily routine. There's a lot of great commentaries out there. And if we have no idea how to answer them, we're going to kind of panic and be like, oh, I don't know, maybe it's all just made up or fictional, and we don't want to say that. So I thought today we can kind of focus on, I have like 3 different slogans in my book that deal with people who take attacks on the Bible.
Okay, yeah, great. Yeah, because, especially in Protestantism, the Bible's looked at as almost like an instruction manual or a catechism, which it's not. It's not meant to be like that. And so if someone says, hey, read the Bible, you'll become an atheist, and you start looking at it skeptically and not knowing, that it's a sacred history, and how there's all this background information you need to know even to rightly approach the Bible. Yeah, that
well,
really
actually, can we plug one of your little, I think it's an ebook you have on things the Bible expects you to know. And I think it's really great because there is a lot of background information that if you're not aware of it, you can let the listeners know, Gary. I'm not sure if it's an ebook or a physical book, but I picked it up one time. I'm like, oh, man, this is good stuff from Gary Machuda. But you're absolutely right. As Catholic Christians, we don't just approach the text in isolation. We have sacred history. We have the tradition of the church. We have magisterial assistance to help us understand the Bible as a whole as part of salvation history. But what is that resource that I'm referring to? I know I read it once.
Yeah, Behind the Bible, what the Bible assumes you already know. It is a hard copy you can buy from Amazon, but I'm giving it away free on my website. So thanks for the plug. I appreciate it. So let's jump into the Bible then, because I know a lot of atheists will have slogans like, really, it's not even a complete thought, but it's like, you take the Bible literally, and then they'll chuckle like, you're so ridiculous to take this stuff literal.
Right. Or they'll ask it as a question, like, do you take the Bible literally? And if you dare say yes, they're like, So what do we respond, though? Because, that's kind of a weird question. Do you take the Bible literally? If somebody asks me that, if somebody asks you that, what I'm going to show you in the book, I just say, ask them a simple question. And I got this from Bishop Robert Barron, and it'll help them reflect on the question that they're asking. Someone says, hey, John, you take the Bible literally? You pause for a second, and then you say, well, I got a question for you. I know you're asking me if I take the Bible literally. Do you take the library literally? Just pose that back to them. They'll be like, what are you talking about? What does that even mean? Do you take the library literally? And I'm like, well, do you go to the library? Do you take it literally? And hopefully that can start to get them to reflect on the idea that it kind of depends. It depends where you are in the library. If you're in the nonfiction historical section, you're going to have, some literal narrative there. If you're in the fiction and novel section, you're going to have stuff there. If you're in the instruction manual section, I like to go to the library actually and pick up the new releases of like technology books and try to understand different new technology. Sometimes you'll find some real gems there that teach you how to do things, with your technology. But the point is, the Bible is more like a library than it is like a single book. So remember that principle. Ask them, do you take the library literally? And then point out the Bible is more like a library than it is a single book. So it really depends what you're talking about and what section. Within the Bible, we have everything from interpretive history to Psalms and poetry. We have Gospels, which are ancient biography. We have epistles, which are letters written to specific people, specific time and places. We have ancient proverbs and books of wisdom sayings. There's a variety of genres and types, and even within a single book, you could have different genres taking place. So, for example, the book of Genesis, people are like, oh, well, that's just one book, written at a single piece of time. Well, there's a lot of different theories on authorship and dating and when it was written, but I think pretty much everybody agrees that there's certain portions of Genesis that are to be taken in a certain light, and other portions that need to be read in a different light. Let me just give you one example, and maybe not everybody agrees on this, but the Catechism of the Catholic Church, paragraph 390, I have it in my book. I'm just going off the top of my head, though. I think it's paragraph 390. They point out the first 3 chapters of Genesis use figurative language. Now, that doesn't mean it doesn't teach us any truth about how God created the world and our first parents. It just means that there can be symbolic things going on in those first few chapters. But then move along later in Israelite history, and we're talking about the story of Joseph and the different patriarchs and so forth, and that's more of a narrative history that we would be more inclined to take literally, though there's still interpretive history going on, and we have to understand that the authors, the way they did history is a little bit different than the journalism, actually a lot different than the journalism that people do nowadays. But the broad point is this: the Bible is a library with a bunch of different genres, and we're going to judge what we take literally and what we don't based on the context, the type of the work, and hopefully informed by tradition and magisterial teaching.
Yeah, excellent. I love the library analogy because, yeah, exactly. That is what I'm talking about, because if you think of the Bible as an owner's manual, that actually would stump you. It's like, yeah, I should take all this stuff literally. But if you see it as a collection of books or a library, like you said, yeah, that's great. You kind of reinform the whole discussion in line with what you're really discussing. It's not an instruction manual. It's a book of books.
And I want to add this too, because I think nowadays we have the wrong expectations when we approach the Bible. Like we just expect, because we're in an arena, we're in a time period of smartphones and instant information. We could Google something in 5 seconds. We literally just expect to be able to open up any book of the Bible and understand it automatically. And that's not how it works. As you said, that's not how God intended it to work. Yes, it tells the story of salvation history, and it's a beautiful, deep story. But guess what? If you've never looked into it before and you haven't read the Bible deeply, each day, you haven't learned from different teachers and bishops and priests, then you're probably going to struggle with it, and it's going to take some study, and that's okay. God intended for the Bible to be read within the church, within the tradition, and over time, it's really kind of amazing. You could start out when you're young, and even when you're older, you're always going to glean new truths, new themes, new symbols, new ideas, and hopefully be convicted to fall more in love with God and Jesus Christ. So I just want to encourage people, don't approach it with that expectation. It's going to take some study.
Yeah. In fact, as Augustine said, that God allowed difficulties in the Bible in order to make us want to dive deeper and resolve them. If it was easy peasy lemon squeezy, first read, I got it. Face it, none of us would study it. We'd just read it once.
That's a good point.
Yeah, very good. The symbol thing too. I think people get thrown off with that. Well, when you say symbol, you mean that you're talking about myth or something that doesn't exist. But isn't it true, John, that when the Bible uses symbols, those are just like literary devices to describe something that's real? Like, for example, you would describe Satan as a snake or a dragon, which, of course, he's an angel. He doesn't have a body. So that would be symbolic, but it's actual real thing it's talking about.
No, that's a great point. So I guess it would kind of be the difference between the description and the sense that we ascribe to the symbol, and also its referent. And there's all different kinds of levels with these different things. But right, you can have different descriptions of Satan and so forth. But what we're referring to is, right, that evil demon who is an angel who fell and hates us and doesn't like us and all that good stuff, or actually bad stuff. But definitely on the symbolic level, we can describe him in different ways. We find this with God as well. He's talked about as having a body, the arm of the Lord, and so forth. Yeah. These are symbolic ways, but we're referring to the one God of Israel, the God of classical theism.
Very good. We're chatting with author John DeRosa of One Less God Than You, Answering Atheist Cliches. We'll be right back right after this.
Help the Helpless, a Minnesota St. Paul nonprofit organization chaired by Father of Tyr and volunteers, is humbly asking you for your kind support to help the poor and the handicapped children in India and Ecuador. Through financial support from the Help of the Helpless benefactors, the children are provided with clothing, food, education, shelter, and the teachings of the Catholic Church. The mission is to help children thrive and become self-sufficient young adults leading productive lives. We also provide aid to poor families in Ecuador with food baskets, medicines, medical assistance, and help with funeral needs for the deceased. The work in India is done by Father Antonio's organization, St. Mary's. In Ecuador, the work is being done by the Servant Sisters of the Home of Mother. You can call us at 877-762-8857. To learn more, please visit our website, www.helpthehelpless.org. God bless you.
Join VMPR live on YouTube September 12, 2020 for our latest free conference, The Ultimate Challenge. This exclusive virtual event will feature a brand new talk from Jesse Romero, How Apologetics Brought Me Back to Faith, plus never-before-broadcast video presentations from Dr. Scott Hahn, Father Mitch Pacwa, and the late, great Father Benedict Groeschel. Go to vmpr.org to register now and get ready to face the ultimate challenge.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show, and they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow, that's 80%. realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
This is Jesse Romero. You're listening to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda on Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
And welcome back, everybody. Hands-On Apologetics. We are chatting with John DeRosa of ClassicalTheism.com about his book, One Less God Than You, handling those atheist slogans and cliches. And John, you pointed out that Bible objections are the ones that seem to stump a lot of Catholics. And for me, I think the biggest ones are things like the God of the Bible is an evil maniac who commits atrocities, or the Bible supports slavery. I've actually received a lot of emails, either asking questions about that or even charging the Bible with that. Where do you even start with something in that category?
Yeah, so those are two good ones. And Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI famously called these the dark passages of Scripture, things that are tough to understand. The atheists will say, look, God's just being a maniac here, evil maniac. And clearly, if the Bible was a moral book, it wouldn't have gotten the slavery question wrong. And the Bible clearly supports slavery. That's an argument Sam Harris and other atheists have put forward. And so those definitely can be tough to deal with, but with some study, you learn the right questions to ask. You learn some principles I'm going to teach you here today. And in the book, you could definitely have some things to respond with. But before you even get into the details, let me just give two questions I suggest that you ask to just start out. And in general, in the book, One Less God Than You, I say the big strategy is whenever possible, start by asking questions rather than making statements. It gets yourself off the hot seat, and it allows you to hear more about what the person you're talking with is actually thinking so that you can give a more helpful response. So if they bring up something like the Bible supports slavery or the God of the Bible is an evil maniac, first thing I would do is say, all right, I'm willing to address those with you, but I just want to ask you, let's say you're right about those things. That wouldn't mean that atheism is true, right? Just say there's some difficult passages on these different kinds of topics. That wouldn't show that God doesn't exist, right? Do we have agreement there? And then just see if they're willing to give that agreement. Because if they're going to want to have an intellectually honest dialogue, they should be able to admit, well, yeah, you're right. Just because there's a difficult passage in an ancient text, that wouldn't show that there's no supreme reality, no ultimate being that we call God. That wouldn't show that, okay? At most, it would show there's a problem in this text. And I would start there because perhaps, you might just have to admit there are some challenging passages, and I'm going to have to look that one up and get back to you. But just because there's a challenging passage doesn't mean that God doesn't exist. And even if you can't resolve it, that wouldn't even show that Christianity isn't true. At most, maybe it would show that there's this hard text we don't know how to understand. Maybe we have to revise how we understand our doctrine of inspiration, what it means that the Scriptures are inspired, but it wouldn't show that God doesn't exist or that Jesus hasn't been risen from the dead and that we should trust in him. So I would first start there and just get that point clear to see if they're going to have that honest conversation. Now, of course, you're going to want to move it forward because as Catholics, we do hold that the Bible is inspired. The books are sacred and canonical, entire with all their parts, as Trent says. And so we want to be able to offer something specific, but I would start there, ask them, hey, even if there's trouble here, that doesn't mean God doesn't exist, right? And then follow up with that and see if they've done their homework. You say the Bible supports slavery. You say God's an evil maniac. Can you give me some more specifics? What exactly do you have in mind? What passages are you talking about? And perhaps we could look at them together. So that's what I would call kind of framing the conversation. And I would recommend people to start with those sorts of questions.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, and that's so important too, because it really puts in perspective, what's really at stake here. Obviously, it doesn't go to the core of Christianity or anything like that, but nevertheless, like you said, we still have to deal with them one way or another.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I thought we could go into some detail. When we'll do the slavery one first, and then we'll do the evil maniac. So if somebody says the Bible supports slavery, how can you say this is a book that's inerrant on faith and morals right there in the text that supports slavery? Well, you're going to have to make some distinctions, and you're going to have to ask some questions, and you're going to have to remember some principles. But I think you can do all of that. And I'm going to just show you the first question to ask. And it's tough because nowadays you got to be sensitive to where people are coming from. And I'll be honest, in our modern culture, a lot of times people don't want to make distinctions. They just want to rail against something and criticize it and in a superficial manner, dismiss it. And they don't even care what you have to say. I think a lot of people run to the Bible supports slavery and God is an evil maniac, because they just want a quick out. They don't want to have to investigate the evidence. They just want a quick reason to dismiss the whole thing. And what we want to point out is you can't do that. But hey, if someone doesn't want to have a nuanced conversation, you don't have to talk to them. So sometimes you got to discern, you got to pray, and perhaps you got to walk away. But if someone's like really interested, they're like, John, I see this slavery stuff. What do I do with it? Okay, here's the first question. Have you considered that slavery can be used in different senses? Have you considered that the word slavery can be used in different senses? And they might mean, well, I don't know. I don't know what the heck you're talking about. Slavery's bad. That's what I know. You know that too. It's wrong to own people. And that's where you want to kind of help them think through these distinctions, because immediately people call to mind the slavery of the antebellum South, that chattel slavery where it was extremely cruel. Slaves were treated as property, and it was obviously and evidently immoral. But there's different senses of this word that sometimes gets translated slavery. It could refer to that terrible antebellum South slavery that we call chattel slavery, where people are reduced to mere property in an inhumane way. But it also could mean something like indentured servitude. And that's where people will sell themselves into servitude or agree to do work for a time to get themselves out of debt, to provide for their families in situations in the wilderness where there was no welfare state, where there was no, easy way to just go down and pick up a check for someone. There weren't any, substantial systems in place where people could automatically be fed. They had to do work and provide for their family. And if they couldn't, they may have died. So one way to get out of that was a system of indentured servitude. And that word still gets translated sometimes as slavery. And then a third type of distinction is penal servitude. And that's where someone is convicted of a crime, perhaps a very serious crime, and they're sentenced perhaps to some forced labor. Or maybe even in an extended sense, people have heard of the draft, and people are being drafted into the army to fight, even in an involuntary way. That's another sense that might be considered a form of servitude or slavery. So at this point, the first thing I just want to mention to people is there's different ways the word can be used. Now, okay, let's move to some more specifics. In the Old Testament, you got to understand it's first and foremost indentured servitude that is being talked about. It's people who are in terrible debt and terrible situations. They're in a poor situation, a poor state of life, and they sell themselves, quote unquote, or agree to work for someone else so that they can get out of debt and they can provide for their family. There's a great example of this. So there's actually a voluntary aspect to it. If you look at Genesis 47:19. Genesis 47:19. This is the story of Joseph, who his brothers originally sold him into slavery, and then eventually he becomes the Pharaoh, and then there's a great famine, and they have no food. And so his brothers actually come to him. They don't know it's Joseph. And they plead with him. And you know what they ask him to do? They ask him, buy us. They say, buy us. Let us be your slaves so that we can be provided for and we don't have to die. So the times we're far removed from these ancient customs, but a lot of times this indentured servitude was a way of preserving life. Here's another way to distinguish it from the chattel slavery. Okay, so that's the first point. It was mostly indentured servitude. Another way to distinguish it. In Exodus, it is absolutely crystal clear. God commands that there is to be no kidnapping of any human persons. It's a crime punishable by death. Kidnapping. Well, guess what? when we call to mind slavery, the antebellum South, they were literally kidnapping people from Africa and forcing them to be their slaves and treating them as mere property. That's not what's going on in Israelite servitude, because they are absolutely forbidden from doing kidnapping. So those are two ways I would distinguish the type of servitude that they talk about from the type that people typically call to mind. But let me just add another big point, and this is in Trent Horn's Hard Sayings, because maybe you make these distinctions and someone's like, I'm still not buying it. They still, God still shouldn't have supported this. There should have been something different. Should have been, not allowed this type of servitude. Here's a big point to remember in general. This is like a principled point. Even if you forgot the specifics I just said, remember this principle. Just because the Bible regulates slavery doesn't mean God recommends it in the end. Okay, so just because the Bible regulates something doesn't mean that God ultimately recommends it or wants it. For example, divorce was permitted in the Old Testament due to people's hardness of hearts. Yet we find in the New Testament that Jesus says, you should not divorce your husband or wife and marry another. Anyone who does that commits adultery. So it wasn't part of God's ultimate plan, yet it was permitted due to the nature of the people and their hardness of hearts. So sometimes God takes a gradual approach to moral issues. First, he regulates it. First, slavery is regulated with these different laws to make it more humane than a lot of the other ancient Near Eastern cultures. And then eventually, it's recommended to be abolished implicitly, I would say, by Jesus' teaching to love neighbor as yourself. And then also St. Paul, there's a great example. In a letter to Philemon, he tells him to grant Onesimus, his slave, to grant his freedom, to receive him as a brother, no longer as a slave. So there is a new covenant time where this practice will eventually be done away with. But God permits it. He regulates it in the Old Testament, perhaps due to the harshness of the conditions and also to people's hardness of heart. So those are some of the distinctions and key points you want to bring out in the slavery discussion.
Yeah, and it's you kind of have to. Very well said. When you're looking at the Old Testament, I think we often think that it's like a novel that came off the press yesterday, when it's actually describing very ancient primitive culture where they didn't have, all those principles and ideas that we operate today, right? That took centuries to inculcate.
Exactly. And I like the example of this. All the ancient civilizations, by the way, practiced some form of servitude and slavery. It wasn't just the Israelites, and their approach was actually more humane because of these laws that are found in the laws of Moses, more humane than other surrounding cultures. But you got to hearken into this example. If God were to just say, like, right from the beginning, no divorce, no slavery, no this, no that, and blah, 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 they may have just rebelled against it and ended up worse off than they were. It's similar to teaching a young child morals and ethics. I don't think you want to make it a rule that you have to bark the ethical code at a 4-year-old, all these complex ethical codes. You got to let them grow up and teach them gradually.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, very well put. We're talking with John DeRosa, classicaltheism.com, about his book, One Less God Than You. If you haven't bought it, definitely go to Amazon, check it out. We'll be right back.
Hi, this is Jesse Romero from the Terry and Jesse Show, also from Jesus 911. Let's face it, we all need to use the internet, but we need screen accountability. Why? Pornography is a huge problem, especially on the internet. And every time we tap into the internet, we get bombarded with images and temptations that degrade our humanity. So we need Covenant Eyes to block these pornographic sites and advertisements from infiltrating our lives. Covenant Eyes helps us take custody of our eyes and custody of our intellect. So I recommend you go to covenanteyes.com and type in the promo code VMPR to support the network. Protect yourself and your family from the imminent threats on the internet. www.covenanteyes.com, code VMPR, live porn free. Thank you for listening to Virgin Most Powerful Radio. Thank you. God bless you. Keep the faith.
Jesus said in Matthew 26, "Stay awake and pray that you may not enter into temptation." According to St. Ephrem, Jesus, who feared nothing, experienced fear and asked to be freed from death, although he knew it was impossible. How much more must we persevere in prayer before temptation assails us, so that we may be freed when the test has come? May God grant that we may withstand temptation and carry out His will in all things.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show, and they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow, that's 80%. realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
Now, back to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2151. Here's Gary.
And welcome back, everybody. Hands-On Apologetics. We were chatting with John DeRosa. John, we were talking about slavery, that cliche about God allowing slavery in the Old Testament. And you did a great job at looking at all the different parameters of that. Why don't we, in the third segment, focus on this one? This is, I've heard this from a number of prominent atheists, that God is some sort of evil maniac, right? That who commits genocide and all this stuff. And I forgot who it was, but there was someone who refused to debate William Lane Craig because he countenances genocide because he believes in the Bible, and the God of the Bible allows genocide.
That's interesting. It might. I know Richard Dawkins famously refused to debate him. I don't know if it was for that issue. It might have been someone else. But you're absolutely right that it is a popular issue that gets raised. And in my opinion, I think it's just one of those quick outs people are looking for. Okay, I found this morally problematic passage. That way, I don't even need to look at the Bible. I don't even need to consider Christianity. Just chuck the whole thing out because it's got this controversial passage in it. So again, remember our opening plan. We're going to push back on that narrative, and we're going to first say, hey, at most, even if you're right about this, that this is a really bad passage, that wouldn't mean that God doesn't exist, right? Perhaps we have to revise our doctrine of inspiration. Perhaps there's an issue in the Old Testament. Maybe there's portions of it that, were corrupted and so forth. But at most, it's not going to show that there's no supreme being or that Jesus didn't rise from the dead, right? Make sure you're on the same page with that. If they don't even agree to that, then they may not really be interested in pursuing the truth and the evidence and having an honest conversation. But let's take a step further. Say they agree. They say, you know what? You're right, John. It doesn't disprove God, but at most it disproves the Bible and the doctrine of inerrancy and inspiration that Catholics hold to, right? You're a Catholic. Don't you hold that the whole Bible is inspired? And it's whole in its parts? And I would say, yeah, absolutely, I do. So let's see if we can look at this claim in more detail. First, let me ask you, what specifically are you talking about? When you say God is an evil maniac and the Israelites are just doing genocide, what exactly do you have in mind? And you got to ask that question first, because otherwise you don't even know if they've done their homework. They might just be parroting someone else, or perhaps they have studied it and they should be able to bring up the texts and adduce the text. So the popular ones, but that's what you ask them. You say, hey, what specifics do you have in mind? What exactly are you talking about? Typically, what gets brought up is God's command to the Israelites to wipe out the Canaanites. Okay, that happens throughout the Joshua narrative. Or there's similar commands in 1 Samuel 15 for the Israelites to attack the Amalekites. Okay, so they're going to point to these different campaigns of the Old Testament Israelite army being commanded. On the face of it, these passages seem to command them to wipe out the Canaanites and the Amalekites. And even in certain passages, it says, every man, woman, child, and oxen. So how do you deal with that? I would say there's two broad approaches for how we can tackle this. And I think actually Dr. Matthew Ramage does a nice job in his book on the dark passages of the Bible. He draws from Pope Benedict and St. Thomas Aquinas. But the two broad approaches are, one, to take these passages at a face value literal reading. And then the second approach is perhaps there's a non-literal way to understand these passages. I think both are possible. I think if you start out with the non-literal way, they might accuse you of just dodging the issue. So let's say that these were literal commands. How are we going to explain this? We got to start with an important principle. And that's this. This is an important principle of classical theism and Catholicism as a worldview. God, as the author and creator of life, has unique authority over human beings, and he has the authority to give and take life as he sees fit. Okay? So he doesn't owe anyone a really long life. If they die as a teenager in a car accident, or if they live to an older age and then die of a heart attack, this is God's prerogative as to how much life he gives. But he has the authority to give and take life as he sees fit. Now, he commands us not to murder and to be good stewards of our neighbor and to love our neighbor. But what's going on there is God is actually commanding the Israelites to conquer the Canaanites and the Amalekites as instruments of his judgment. He's deputizing them to act on his behalf to, wipe out the Canaanites and the Amalekites in these instances. The Israelites didn't have that authority on their own. And if God didn't give that command, then it would be wrong for them to do that. People can't just kill others, but God does have that right to take life. So that's the first principle to get on the table. And to help motivate that, I would ask a question like this, actually getting away from killing for a second. Say, hey, let me just ask you a question. Does an ambulance driver have the right to run a red light, even though we don't have the right to do that? Or, hey, does a professor have the right to cancel a class for the day, even if, a student in the class can't do that? And hopefully they would admit yes, because the ambulance driver and the professor acting in those capacities have a unique authority with their own special prerogatives, and they can do that, even if students or people can't do that on their own. Okay, but people aren't going to like that's a tough first point to swallow a lot of the time, so here's what you should follow up with. I want to add God's judgment will be perfect and there will be no mistakes. Sometimes people worry that in this clash of armies and people dying, somehow some innocent people are going to get swept up in the calamity and end up in the wrong place. Maybe they would have gone to heaven, but because of this horrible issue and calamity, they end up going to hell. And that's just not how it works. God's judgment will be perfect. And if these people had their wills towards God, responding to the sufficient grace that he gives to all men to be saved, well, then they will be saved. And we believe by the blood of Jesus Christ through his church, which can be proleptically applied. That gets a little bit technical. But the idea is this: even if they're not part of the Israelite army, if their will and their heart is towards God, they can be saved. Great example is Rahab. Rahab in the Old Testament is not an Israelite. She's not a Jew. Yet somehow she responds to the natural revelation that she's been given, and she recognizes God and wants to follow God. And she's praised in the book of James, for example, for the holiness and for what she does. So God can reach through to people, and God's judgment will be perfect. There will be no mistakes. So yes, God has the authority, even if people don't, and his judgment will be perfect, and there will be no mistakes. And if you remember those two principles, I can't promise people are going to like them. In fact, they're probably going to dislike those principles, but just disliking them doesn't mean they aren't true. And if they are true, which I hold as a Catholic, well, then this is God's prerogative, and there actually is no substantial problem.
Right. Yeah, very good. Yeah, if they have a problem, then all you have to do is go back to proofs for the existence of God and things like that.
Exactly. And I mean, what I would add, though, is because people do have trouble stomaching that nowadays. They don't want to give God that authority in that classical theism. So some have proposed, well, is there another way we could take these passages? Is there perhaps, when it says to Israel to wipe out every man, woman, child, and oxen, is maybe they didn't quite mean that so literally. And there's actually a good case to be made for this. So this is not just, made up because we didn't like the passage. I just told you a way that we could take the passage fully literally. But there is precedent for this. In the ancient Near East, there's been studies done. Paul Copan in God is Not a Moral Monster adduces some of the evidence. He's got a more recent book out, too, where he argues further that this type of language can be chalked up to ancient warfare rhetoric that's like, rah, rah, we're going to crush the other team. And so when it says kill every man, woman, child, and oxen, it's really the command. The reality denoted by those words is that the Israelites should drive the Canaanite and Amalekite armies out of the land. They should attack and drive them out of the land. And rah, it's trying to whip them up into victory mode to conquer and to do that. But it doesn't necessarily literally have to mean that they have to kill every child, oxen, and woman along with it. It could be part and parcel with that rhetoric. I like to use this example. This isn't in my book, but I thought of it recently. When I was in Little League, like I think 5th grade, baseball, one of our coaches used to say to us before the game, and it kind of became a joke. He would be like, all right, we're gonna crush the other team. But then he kept adding like these vivid and like graphic things we were gonna do to the other team that were obviously not literal, but we found it like funny and it got us whipped up. So he'd be like, all right, today we're gonna crush this team and we're gonna slash their throats and rip out their intestines. And we were like, yeah, let's go do that. Now, nowadays, I don't know, people may not have the stomach for that, but as kids, we just kind of found it funny and part of that rhetoric. So people have pointed out perhaps this warfare rhetoric can account for why we see the passages read in that way. And Bishop Barron has actually pointed back to Origen, giving a nice allegorical interpretation to this as well. So another layer is that these passages, they're written this way because the Israelites driving out the Amalekites and Canaanites shows us how we ought to drive out sin in our own lives. All right, so we talked about symbolic interpretations. This is an allegorical reading of the Old Testament passage. Doesn't mean it has to be the only reading, but it's a significant reading that has foundation in the tradition that God is telling them, don't toy around with sin. Don't toy around with these Amalekites and Canaanites. You need to wipe it out. Wipe it completely out of your life. Don't just toy around with it, let it toy around, and then, oh, sin comes back to get you. No, you need to crush it. Get it out. And that's what Origen said to do, and others who have read this passage allegorically, it could be interpreted as how we should treat sin in our own lives. So that's an additional reading. You could take literal or non-literal approach to the idea that God is an evil maniac, and I think hopefully you can make some distinctions and have a more substantial discussion.
Yeah, I love that because somebody might say, well, why in the world would God choose to use this literary device that seems so, destructive and bloodthirsty in that? But, you can see the wisdom of God by placing that command within that literary structure, that it's applicable to Christians later on in regards to sin, right? So I love that. It provides explanation of it.
And that's that extra layer that you'll get from people like Bishop Barron and St. Thomas Aquinas and others, that even if you take, a passage in a certain way, you still have to ask, well, hey, why did the Holy Spirit inspire it to be written that way? Yeah. And one of the reasons, if it is non-literal, is because it applies to our lives. Let's cut out the sin, let's drive it out, and never let it come back.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I love that. John, we got maybe a minute and a half or so. Where can people get the book, and tell us what's coming up on classical theism?
Oh, I appreciate you asking that question. Well, first, the book, classicaltheism.com/new book. And that's the direct link, but they can also find it on Amazon or on Catholic.com. But classicaltheism.com/new book. What's upcoming? I'll tell you what, I have a great interview coming out on Monday. I was just sitting down. I ended up sitting down with a American Catholic theologian for almost 2 hours. And he was just giving us some great stuff about the proofs of God and the resurrection of Jesus. His name is Dr. Matthew Levering. Check him out, Dr. Matthew Levering, and he's going to talk about proofs of God and the resurrection of Jesus in the Catholic worldview.
All right. Well, John, hey, thanks so much for coming on the show. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Gary. Always happy to be here.
All right. That's classicaltheism.com, folks. Check it out. Lots of great interviews by John. He does a fantastic job. Man, the hour is flown. But never fear, because Terry and Jesse will soon be here, the dynamic duo of Catholic Talk Radio with the Terry and Jesse Show. Thank you so much for listening. God willing, we'll be back again tomorrow. Bye-bye, everybody.
In the 1990s, I lived and worked in Hollywood. But when my wife Betty's mom took ill, we relocated to Orange County. And it was during this time in our lives that I converted to Catholicism. Once my eyes were opened to the truth, I couldn't learn enough about the faith. But I had less free time than ever, especially with a long commute. That's when I discovered the real value of Catholic audio. Listening to cassette tapes transformed my daily commute into a miniature retreat. And that's the beauty of Virgin Most Powerful Radio today. Since the podcasts are archived, You can listen anytime on our smartphone app. I know how listening to Catholic audio can bring you closer to Christ and His Church. So I encourage you to visit the App Store or go to vmpr.org and download the app today. It just might change your life. I'm Matthew Arnold for Virgin Most Powerful Radio.